Welcome to the CST Flight Services video series. In this video, we're going to cover the documents and equipment that are required to make an international private flight, based on what we know today. This video assumes that you will be flying a land-based aircraft on a private flight. If you plan to fly in a seaplane or as a charter, then please contact us, as additional U.S. and foreign regulations will apply. As international regulations are constantly changing and being updated, we urge you, before you make your flight, to contact the embassies and the civil aviation departments of the countries you plan to fly to or fly over to get the very latest information. Before we begin, it is very important that every pilot understands that we are subject to the regulations and the jurisdictions of the countries where we plan to operate. Our very own FAR 91.703 spells that out very clearly. All crew and passengers must have a passport to fly internationally, and most countries require that the expiration date of that passport be at least 6 months beyond the date of entry into their country. While they may be valid for certain land and sea crossing, passport cards are not valid for any flight whatsoever. While US and Canadian citizens typically do not need a visa to fly in the Western Hemisphere, there's always the exception. So make sure that both for yourself and any citizens of other countries that may be flying with you, that no visas are required. Unless you are a signatory carrier with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, you cannot carry citizens from visa waiver program countries on board your aircraft into the United States. There are very specific situations where it may be possible, but they are the exception, not the norm, and you should check with U.S. Customs and Border Protection before attempting to do so. If a minor will be traveling without one or both of the parents flying with them, you should prepare a notarized letter of authorization for the minor to travel with the parent or guardian that they will be accompanied by. A sample template is available on the CST member website. If you will travel to a country that is considered by the World Health Organization as at risk for yellow fever, other countries that you subsequently fly to may request a yellow fever vaccination certificate, and you must have with you the original certificate. All foreign countries have regulations controlling the entry and exit of pets into their country. In addition, the CDC in the US has also been publishing restrictions. And remember, even though the pet may have originated from the United States, when it's time to return, they will consider that pet's origin as the country you are flying from. Other things to consider: your medical insurance. You should review your policy to determine if it covers you in the country you plan to fly to and what services and benefits they provide while you're there. If you plan to take items of value with you out of the United States, such as camera equipment, photography equipment, watches, guns, you need to go to U.S. Customs and Border Protection before leaving the U.S., prepare and present a Form 4457 and get it approved. This will prove that those items originated in the U.S. and are not being imported into the U.S. and are not subject to duties. Depending on the port, you may have to fill out a customs declaration form known as the 6059 Bravo. You can download a PDF fillable copy from the CST member website. In addition, you will need an APIS account or accounts, one definitely for the U.S. to submit the Advanced Passenger Information System manifest, but other countries have their own APIS regulations as well. For each person who plans to act as a crew member, they're going to need the following documents. First of all, an airman certificate that we commonly refer to as a pilot's license. The airman certificate should be for a minimum of a private pilot rating or better. Note that student pilot certificates are not valid for any international flight, and most countries do not recognize the light sport pilot certificate, except the Bahamas. For international flights, the airman certificate must have the phrase English proficient on the back. If it doesn't, then there's a quick and easy way to get it added, which is covered in the CST member website. Temporary airman certificates are normally valid for international flights, provided that they are still within the 120-day validity period. You will also need a valid medical certificate. Note that certain countries require that the medical certificate class match the airman certificate that you are using and not necessarily the privileges that you are exercising. Basic Med is not a substitute for a medical certificate. Very, very few countries will recognize Basic Med as a valid medical certificate. U.S. Federal Communications regulations require that at least one crewman on board the aircraft have at least a restricted radio operator permit. A link to the FCC website can be found on the CST member website. If you are operating a Cessna 500 series jet, the 500, the 550, or the 560, under a single pilot exemption issued by the FAA, note that these waivers are only valid in the U.S. unless the country that you plan to fly to has granted you permission. Remember, those aircraft were originally type certificated for a minimum of 2 crew. Also, don't try to play with the rules and get by with FAR 61.55. It's not valid for international flights. For the aircraft, you must have a valid airworthiness certificate on board the aircraft. If the aircraft has gone through a change in registration number, be certain that you have updated the airworthiness certificate with your local FSDO as required by regulation. One common question that we get is, can I take my experimental aircraft to XYZ country? Well, it depends, because if you look on the back of your airworthiness certificate, you're going to see that it clearly states that you must obtain permission from the countries that you plan to operate in. And the newer ones go one step further and state that that permission must be in writing and available on board the aircraft to present to an FAA inspector or the inspector of the Foreign Civil Aviation Authority. You will also need a valid permanent registration certificate. Make sure that the expiration date on the certificate is beyond the date of your planned international flight. One valid temporary registration certificate is the FAA Flywire issued by the FAA in Oklahoma City. It needs to be within the expiration date of the Flywire. You can never make an international flight using the pink temporary registration certificate. Those are not valid. And you should avoid making any international flights while in the process of re-registering your aircraft, changing the tail number. Avoid making any international flights until the tail number on the aircraft matches the registration certificate tail number, the airworthiness tail number, and your insurance policy tail number. FCC and international regulations also require that the aircraft have a radio station license. Again, the link to the FCC website can be found on the CST member website. Any aircraft conducting an international flight must have, just as we require in the US, an AFM or a POH. You must also have on board your signed weight and balance document with the tail number of the aircraft clearly visible. Many countries will use the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft to base their airport and airspace fees. Next, you must have a CBP user fee decal that is valid for the current calendar year affixed to the aircraft in order to satisfy US regulations and re-enter the US. You should obtain one before leaving the US, as you will need that decal number to properly complete your APIS manifest with CBP. If you are entering the US for a country that CBP considers south of the US, and you wish to overfly one of the 32 mandatory CBP designated airports, you will need a border overflight exemption and bring that exemption with you. You can request an exemption from CBP or on the CST main website. CST members get a discounted price for that service. You should make sure that your insurance policy shows your aircraft registration number, the policy number, the policy period, and the territory coverages, and provides both hull and liability coverage in the countries that you plan to operate in. While most countries only require the liability portion, you will feel awfully silly if something were to happen and your hull was not covered. If you are planning to fly in RVSM airspace and you obtained your RVSM through the installation of your ADS-B under Part 91 Appendix G, Section 9, then you will have to get a specific letter of authorization for RVSM in order to make international flights. You cannot fly internationally under 91G9. Also, if you plan to fly on RNP routes, such as in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Western Atlantic Tract, you will need a letter of authorization for RNP-10 or RNP-4 airways. You will also need suitable charts for the entire trip. Do not expect to find any aeronautical charts while you are traveling in foreign countries. Get everything that you need before you depart. Downloadable VFR and IFR charts are available on the CST member website. If you plan to fly to Bermuda, bear in mind that for private operations, Bermuda requires that you have SMS, Safety Management System. As some U.S. aircraft are registered to a corporation versus an individual, foreign civil aviation authorities may jump to the conclusion that you are actually operating a charter aircraft. Therefore, we recommend that you bring with you a notarized letter from the officer of the company that owns the aircraft that authorizes the pilot, which may be the owner, and the passengers to fly on board that aircraft on an international private flight. This way you draw a line between the owner, the aircraft, the pilot, and the passengers, and clarify that this is a private, non-charter flight. A template for that letter can be found on the CST member website. Certain geographic areas may require additional communications and navigation equipment. So make sure that the routes that you plan to fly don't require equipment beyond what you would normally have on an aircraft. For international flights, you will need a Mode C transponder as well as ADS-B. And outside the United States, they will only accept ADS-B 1090 extended squitter. They do not use 978 UAT. And to cross the U.S.'s Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, you are required to have a minimum of 12-inch tall letters on the aircraft that comply with 14 CFR Part 45.29. Make sure that your nav databases for your navigation equipment, GPS, FMS, contain the database for the geographical area that you plan to fly to. Trying to accomplish this once you've entered the international airspace can be very difficult and very expensive. Most countries require a 406 megahertz emergency locator transmitter, or ELT. And in addition, they require that if you're going to fly beyond the gliding distance from shore, that you have on board sufficient life jackets and life rafts for all of the occupants on board the aircraft. If you plan to be doing a lot of flying at low altitude, you may want to consider for at least the pilot, if not everyone on board, constant wear life vest, because if you didn't have it on you when you got on board the aircraft, you probably won't have it on you when you get out. In addition, bring suitable survival equipment for the environment that you're going to be flying in. There is additional information on survival equipment and strategies located in the CST member website. You should always assume that you will not find anything for your aircraft once you leave the US. So bring all of the oil, additives, accessories that you need with you. And in addition, if weight and space allow, any spare parts, because as Murphy's Law in reverse will state, if you bring it with you, it won't break. You may also want to check with the manufacturer of your aircraft to identify service locations and parts availability in the countries where you're going to operate. In case of emergencies, it's a great idea to bring with you a handheld VHF radio. And if you're going to be flying over water, we recommend not only an aviation handheld, but a marine aviation radio as well. Satellite phones also make an excellent addition to your survival equipment. I wouldn't purchase it necessarily for a trip, but if you or a friend has one, it's a great item to have with you. Regardless of whether it's required or not, we also recommend that you bring a 406 megahertz personal locator beacon. And if you're going to be flying over water, get one that floats. Satellite-based tracking devices like the Garmin inReach are also great so that you can constantly report to friends and family your location. And many of those can also send and receive messages via satellite as well. For the life jackets, I also attach Cyalume sticks and strobe lights as well. That makes it much easier to locate you at night. A few other things to keep in mind. The buck stops at the left seat. You can't blame your spouse or the lady back at the office if you forgot your passport, forgot to file your APIS. The PIC is legally responsible both in the US and in all foreign countries. Always make sure that you have at least 2 blank pages in your passport for stamps. And with regards to life jackets, avoid using life jackets that automatically inflate when they come into contact with water. The worst thing that could happen is that your life jacket suddenly inflate while you're trying to exit from a submerged aircraft cabin. For more information and resources on how to conduct an international flight, the CST member website has a wealth of information that we have amassed over many, many years and kept up to date with current information. This concludes our video on documents and equipment for international flights. We hope you found this information useful, and we encourage you to look at all the other videos in the video series to help you plan your international flight.